Excellencies, dear leaders, distinguished participants, a warm welcome from my office in Seoul, Korea. Thank you to Dr. Dino Patijalal, Chairman of Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, and my dear colleague Michael Sheldrick, co-founder of Global Citizen, for hosting this important day of dialogue. The theme of this global town hall is one that is close to my heart: sustaining peace and development in a divided world. I recently published my memoir with a similar title, Uniting Nations in a Divided World, where I share the defining experiences as the 8th United Nations Secretary General. Dear global citizens, as we are all sadly aware, the world is currently faced with numerous challenges such as worsening climate change, followed by a looming food crisis, extreme poverty, the global disruption to education, and more. I must underline that the climate crisis is the biggest threat, exacerbating the multitude of such alarming global issues. There is no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has also shed light to significant inequalities, especially among women and youth in all countries, however prosperous they may be. Moreover, humanitarian crises are ravaging all over the world, from Afghanistan to Myanmar, from Ethiopia to Yemen, and most recently, Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. During the month of August, I was in Ukraine myself, and I have been very outspoken against the unacceptable massive atrocities committed against the Ukrainian people by Russian military. This must be condemned in the strongest terms. All of these catastrophes that we witness have consequences far beyond the immediate impacts. We must stand up for a world where we can all have safe, prosperous, healthy, and equal lives. This is why the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, which I co-chair with my dear friend, Dr. Heinz Fischer, former president of Austria, we focus on programs which target the most vulnerable people in our world, women and youth. We empower them with an entrepreneurial mindset and skill set to create and implement solutions towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Currently, we have a network of over 200 agents of change advancing inclusive and sustainable social and economic development around the world. We also work with several local and international partners, including the co-organizers of today's event, Global Citizen. We are contributing to the best of our abilities, but we need to do more to activate youth voices to support the most vulnerable of our communities and get to what really matters: positive impact on lives and livelihoods. In this regard, I want to highlight our advocacy work, calling for increased financial and political commitment to build the resilience of smallholder farmers who urgently need our support to adapt to climate change. Having a positive impact on lives and livelihoods is a message I have tried to spread throughout my career. We have a moral responsibility to act for the better good wherever we are and however we define our place on this earth. I call this global citizenship. When I was 18 years old, I was selected to join the American Red Cross program called Operation Vista, visiting international students to America, which was a program that brought me and other young leaders to the United States from some 40 countries. Our group was invited to the White House, and I was deeply inspired by President John F. Kennedy's remarks. He told us that good work has no borders and no nationality. He said, what mattered was, I quote, whether you are ready to extend your helping hand. I knew then there should be a voice for the voiceless and defender for the defenseless. Today, there are approximately 1.8 billion young people around the world. As the largest young generation in history, you will not only determine the course of your own lives, but also that of our planet. The recent youth-driven response to global issues like education and the climate crisis shows how you can steer powerful movements. I'm hopeful to see more young voices such as Malala Yousafzai, Greta Thunberg, and Vanessa Nakate becoming such powerful role models to people all around the world, no matter their age. I hope during the next 15 hours of deliberations, you will create a meaningful partnerships and concrete steps to take forward. I wish you all the best and thank you for your passion and compassion. Thank you.
We see a rise of authoritarianism, a war of values, and deepening polarization, growing social inequalities, and unprecedented levels of hunger, further complicated by climate crisis. We are living in a time of multifaceted and multidimensional crisis. With the direction of world affairs becoming more divided and volatile, marked by increased confrontation and mistrust in the strategic, diplomatic, economic, and political realms, what can we expect for the future of our world? What are our chances of sustaining peace and development in our divided world? We have here a very distinguished panel of speakers. The Honorable Kevin Rudd, President and CEO of Asia Society. He was Prime Minister of Australia from 2007 to 2010 and again in 2013. Kevin Rudd became President and CEO of Asia Society in January 2021 and has been President of the Asia Society Policy Institute since January 2015. He served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010, then as Foreign Minister from 2010 to 2012, before returning as Prime Minister in 2013. He's also a leading authority on China. He began his career as a China scholar, serving as an Australian diplomat in Beijing before entering Australian politics. The Honorable Priyanka Chaturvedi. She is currently a Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, representing the state of Maharashtra. As a Member of Parliament, she's a member of the Standing Committee for Commerce, Consultative Committee for the Ministry of External Affairs, and Parliament Committee for Women Empowerment. She previously served as the national spokesperson of the Indian National Congress. We also have with us Professor Kishore Mahbubani. Professor Kishore is a distinguished fellow at the Asian Research Institute of the National University of Singapore. He was with the Singapore Foreign Service for 33 years, from 1971 to 2004. He had postings to Cambodia, Malaysia, Washington, D.C., and New York, where he twice served as Singapore's ambassador to the UN, and sat in as the president of the UN Security Council from January 2001 to May 2002. He was the permanent secretary at the Foreign Ministry from 1993 to 1998. Without further ado, we shall start the first session, and my question will be to the Honorable Kevin Rudd. Elon Musk recently bought over Twitter and said he would disband its content moderation platform. He later said it would be replaced by a moderation council. Do you have any concerns that Twitter could now potentially be a platform to spread hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories? And secondly, are we now living in a world where social media is increasingly weaponized and becoming a threat to stability, freedom, and democracy?
Well, greetings. Today I come to you from the Middle East, where it's a bright and breezy 6 a.m. in the morning. So I look forward to this discussion with colleagues from Singapore and from India, and of course our dear friends in Indonesia. Your question goes to the future of social media and its impact on democracy and on political order. And this is part of the wider question of the role of media today in sustaining the lifeblood of our democracies. And the media therefore carry great responsibility in any functioning democracy, whether it's India or whether it's elsewhere in the world, my own home country of Australia, or where I now live and work in the United States. The critical challenge that we have had in the last decade or so across multiple media platforms in the world, both conventional, traditional, and social, is what I describe as the convergence of fact with opinion. It's very difficult to manage a democracy if you have the continued conflation of fact and opinion. People, when they participate in the open political debate of their systems, unless they have a reasonable common basis of fact upon which to operate in their political discussion, you can never actually then achieve a lasting basis of consensus. Let me talk briefly, therefore, about the United States, where I live and work. It's the world's most powerful country still. And when I look at the current state of the American democracy, it is served very badly by the polarization of the United States media in the traditional sense, whether it's Fox in one direction or CNN in the other, and in the social media sense, when I look at what then lands on social media platforms pretending to be fact, when in fact it is opinion, and in many respects, extreme opinion, animated by questions of race and racial hatred. This, therefore, is a challenge not just for the American democracy, but for democracies right across the world, given the inherent nature of social media, which places power in the hands of those who own the platforms, a bit like traditional publishers, but which is therefore able through algorithms to be deployed in support of particular causes and sometimes extreme causes. On the question of Elon Musk and the future of Twitter, the jury is still out. We are barely a week into the new regime with Twitter. I was the first Australian candidate for the Prime Ministership of my country to use Twitter and social media on a mass scale in a campaign. So I know little about the power of social media and how these things are deployed. I think it's critically important that US regulators, which is where, of course, Twitter is based, but national regulators around the world look very carefully in a quantitative sense about any measure of the use of hate speech or incitements to racial hatred or incitements to racial violence on any social media platform, and those regulators act accordingly. We cannot allow any instrument of media to be dominated or abused by a single individual or a single extremist view, which ultimately poisons the well of our common democracies. So on the question of Twitter, the jury is still out. We will watch very carefully the composition of Elon Musk's proposed council, which will be there to moderate content. But if there is a radical shift in the quantum of racially inspired platform communications on the platform, then I believe it will be time for all of us to respond with our own appropriate instruments views, and in the case of regulators, action. Back to you.
Thank you very much for the very insightful comments. We next move to the Honorable Priyanka Chaturvedi. Today in Iran, thousands and thousands of protesters, many of them young women, are risking their lives to fight for their rights following the death of Mahsa Amini. As of Thursday, 277 protesters have been killed. In Afghanistan, girls are banned from going to school since the Taliban returned to power. In Ukraine, Russian soldiers are raping women. The youngest victim is 4 years old, while the oldest one is 83, according to the UN. Looking at what's happening, do you fear for the rights of women? And secondly, will the events in Iran harden misogynistic attitudes amongst authoritarian rulers in Iran and other countries? Will this make them fear women even more and trigger the need for them to further restrict women's rights and crack down more brutally?
Thank you so much for having me on this panel with esteemed panelists, and a very good morning from India. What I'd like to say on this particular issue is that it is not just something which is impacting Iran, but tremors of it are being felt globally. Every woman who has been violated, who has seen some kind of gender-based violence, is totally connecting with the protests that have broken out in Iran. And the pushback that is coming from across the cities of Iran goes to show that women are not going to be taking this lying down, and societies would need to transform, adjust. And the fight is not just about women here. The fight has moved on to the entire regime, the authoritarianism and using religion to subjugate women, to subjugate its citizens, is something which we are seeing in Iran. Like I said, you're seeing the global impact of it. Zan Zindagi Azadi is now a slogan which every single woman is not just woman, every single citizen, global citizen is talking about. It is about rights. It is about the 50% of the global population seeking its space in the global world order. Now, we spoke about the challenges. I was listening to His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, where he spoke about climate change being a massive challenge. Post-COVID-19 world is what you have been speaking about. We're talking about wars across the region, whether it's Ukraine and Russia, and some suspect this could trigger more uncertainties across the global world order. We're talking about education, we're talking about technology. Every single space has women impacting, women not being present in enough numbers to be able to have their words spoken or to be able to put their point of view across. Technology has ensured, we were speaking about Twitter with His Excellency Kevin Rudd. Twitter has silenced many women's voices. Twitter has also encouraged, social media platforms have also encouraged a lot of misogyny, a lot of sexism, and a lot of trolling and abuse directed at women, which ends up silencing women. Access to technology has been the biggest challenge for women globally. I come from India, and India faces that as one big challenge. And we saw that during COVID-19, where girls dropped out of studying further because they did not have access to mobile phones and technology. So that is also something. And I think it's not just an India problem, it is an Asia problem that we're looking at. Globally also, it was something that was spoken about. Various reports show that climate change is going to impact women the most. And we are still not talking about that impactfully enough. And I would say in the whether it is the United Nations, whether it is any power center, any power table, that intersectionality of climate change and how it impacts women is somehow being left out in the conversation. The growing protectionism that we see, where countries are raising their barriers and entry points and exit points, are also impacting its women. So these are a few challenges that women face, and what is happening in Iran. The cost of war for women in Ukraine is also an indicator of the challenges we women face. In terms of representation in positions of power, we are abysmally low. Now, for example, why should we just limit it to Iran, limit it to Afghanistan, how women, we are now seeing empty classrooms, schools being bombed, 53 girls lost their lives in a bomb attack in September. Look at the United States of America debating the Roe versus Wade. So though the abortion rights being denied to them. So those are challenges that women face, that we are somehow moving back. The progress that was made over the years, over liberal regimes, are also now, because of the rising authoritarianism, is now being reduced to just lip service, and women having to push back all over again to fight for their space under the sun and for equal opportunities, equal access. And that is what we see today. But the Zaan Zindagi Azadi is something which gives us hope, which gives every woman the feeling of unity and fighting it from any geographical part of the world, but fighting for the cause of women.
Thank you for this very heartfelt conversation and comment. For Professor Kishore, earlier this year, Sri Lanka's economic trouble took a turn for the worse, exacerbated by skyrocketing food and fuel costs, triggering massive protests that ousted the government. The global food crisis and high energy costs is not going away anytime soon as Russia continues with its war on Ukraine. Do you see a Sri Lanka breaking out in other parts of the region? And if so, what are those countries? And secondly, do you feel that governments in the region have a grip of the enormity of the crisis that we are facing right now?
Thank you, Amy. I want to thank Ambassador Dino Parijalal for inviting me to join this remarkable global town hall meeting where you have over 7,000 participants in 140 countries. And I want to emphasize that fact, because the fact that we're having this global town hall meeting with 7,000 participants shows that the most important fact about our world is that we live in a small global village. And why do I emphasize that? You asked me a question about Sri Lanka. Why did the fire start in Sri Lanka? Was it because Sri Lanka mismanaged its economy? Yes, but that's only half the answer. The other half of the answer is that the global economy is in trouble and we are completely integrated today. So even if Sri Lanka took care of its house very well, it will still catch fire because the global economy in our global village is in trouble. Now, I want to emphasize one very key point. You're right, there will be other Sri Lankas coming. Certainly. And even if you manage your country well, when global energy prices shoot up to over $100, when inflation comes at you, what can you do? You live in a small little global village, you'll be hit by it. So therefore, to solve this problem, it cannot be done by Sri Lanka alone. It requires global economic coordination. And I want, we had a global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, when actually the richest home was on fire. The United States of America had a big fire. And guess what? The world came together at the G20 meeting to save the world. And even China contributed $50 billion to a $1 trillion package to save the global economy. So when the richest house was on fire, we all came together. Today, when the poorer house is on fire, we don't come together. And let me explain why. Because in our small global village today, we have two elephants, the United States and China. And both of them have decided that what's more important for them is to decide which elephant is bigger, who's number one, United States or China, and they started a massive struggle. And I can tell you that we will have problems in the next 10 years because the US-China geopolitical contest will accelerate. So for those of us who live in this small, vulnerable global village, my answer is that if you want to stop the fires in Sri Lanka, we must, all of us, 7.8 billion people, come together and tell US and China, for God's sake, we have more important things to do than to watch the two of you struggle about who's number one. let's come together, as we did in 2008, 2009, launch a global economic stimulus package that especially takes care of poor countries like Sri Lanka and the African countries and the Latin American countries. Because unless we do that, there will be more Sri Lankas. You're muted, Amy.
Thank you, Professor, for your very articulate views. We move round to the second round of intervention and question from discussions. We have here from Japan, Kopchai Songsi Sangha of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. The floor is yours.
Good day to the honored speakers and participants of this session. I'm very honored to be a discussant for this session. So I have a question, maybe a follow-up question from Professor Kishore regarding the deglobalization. So since the trade war between the US and China, various barriers among countries have been heightened to bar trade, investment, and even people from moving freely. It has even become aggravated by the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine. In addition, right-wing politicians and conservatives have won elections. So do you envision that we will enter a decoupling world? If so, how do we stop it?
Next, we have Mr. Eksai Khan from Mongolia, where he heads a Blue Banner, an NGO. The floor is yours, Mr. Eksai Khan.
Sorry. Yes, thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers of this global town hall for organizing this important event at a time when the world is undergoing many changes that impact the lives of millions of people, not only today, but in the future as well. The issues of sustaining peace, justice, and development in this divided world need to be discussed at every level, including at the level of ordinary citizens. In that sense, the role of civil society organizations and think tanks serve as important factors that can influence the political atmosphere and policies of states in charting the future. At this session, we've heard the keynote speech of His Excellency Mr. Ban Ki-moon, as well as statements of well-known and recognized statesmen and public figures. I'm sure that we have all learned much from their interventions on how they see the world today, prospects of future possible developments, and what, in their view, needs to be done to strengthen confidence, social justice, and development, which is being made possible by this open platform. I'm glad that the Honorable Ban Ki-moon and Professor Kishore have shared their rich experience on global issues. Having worked closely with both of them at the United Nations, I would like to ask them about the challenges in reforming the United Nations Security Council, one of the most important organs of this organization, so that it would duly reflect the realities of today and not that of 7 decades ago. My question is how the composition of the Security Council can reflect the realities and needs of the 21st century world, and what and how should be done so that the Council serves the interests of the broader membership and not primarily the narrow interests of the unelected permanent members of the Security Council that are known among the UN members as the oligarchs. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Perhaps Professor Kishore could go first to speak on decoupling and also reforming the UN, since you served on the UN, and followed by the Honorable Kevin Rudd and Priyanka Chaturvedi. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Given the limited time we have, I'll try to be as brief as possible, even though these questions are huge questions, as you know. Now, on decoupling, I think Dr. Kopchai is absolutely right. there is now a process of deglobalization that is happening. But I want to emphasize that there are two contradictory streams at the same time. Certainly, in the past, the world's #1 champion of globalization was the United States of America. And the rest of us actually resisted it in ASEAN. Also, we said, no, we don't like globalization. Now the world has changed, and we have exactly the opposite situation, where it's the United States which is actually deglobalizing, is refusing to sign free trade agreements. For example, it left the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By contrast, in East Asia, hasn't given up on globalization. And the world's largest free trade agreement of ASEAN and China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand was launched in January this year. And so that's going to create, in a sense, a global contradiction that we have to deal with. But I also want to emphasize that the United States deglobalization is also in part triggered by the fact that it wants to stop China's rise. And therefore, the CHIPS Act was passed to kneecap China, to make sure that China doesn't have the same quality of chips as the United States and the West does. So it's part of the US-China struggle. But I would say from the East Asian point of view, where we live in East Asia, I think we are not walking away from globalization. And indeed, if you look at the trade figures, let me just give you ASEAN-China trade figures. In the year 2000, it was 40 billion, now it's over 800 billion. So I predict that the globalization in our region will continue. Now, on the Ensaikan's important question of UN Security Council reform, I can tell you I was a member of the open-ended working group on Security Council reform for many years when I was ambassador to UN. And after some time, people said, let's change the name of the group from the open-ended working group on Security Council reform to the never-ending working group on Security Council reform, because it's been going on now for almost 30 years and nothing has happened. So the fact that after 30 years, nothing has happened shows that there's some fundamental obstacles to UN Security Council reform. And let me give away the big secret. The 5 permanent members may disagree on a lot, but they actually agree they want to keep the club to themselves and not include anybody else. And in my book, The Great Convergence, I say that the Security Council has a dilemma. Either you keep your composition or you keep your credibility. And to give you a simple example, India is now the 5th largest economy in the world. India will become the 3rd largest economy in the world within 10 years or so. And a Security Council that doesn't have India as a permanent member has no credibility. If you have yesterday's powers with the veto, UK and France, and not tomorrow's powers, India with the veto, then Security Council has no credibility. And it also has to include some Brazil from Latin America. It also has to include countries of Africa, because unless they include India, an African country, a Latin American country as permanent members of veto, there is no more credibility for the UN Security Council. Thank you. You're muted again, Amy.
Thank you, Professor. The Honorable Kevin Rudd, the floor is yours.
I think what Kishore said is right about the trend line towards deglobalization. The only thing I'd say is that it's not being exclusively driven by the United States, although that is a factor. And it's not just being driven by the Trump administration's decision to exit from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You see these behaviors by a range of governments around the world, which for local political and narrow economic reasons seek to protect their economies from international competition. And then secondly, you have a problem that when international competition exists, you have other large economies like China who use massive domestic subsidy arrangements to overwhelm competition in other economies. Kishore would know full well, for example, the deployment of national subsidies within China in the solar panels industry, whereby China has now become almost the exclusive global manufacturer and supplier of such panels, deploying huge subsidies, and the net effect of which is to squeeze other producers of those products out of the global market. So physical protectionism at the border is one thing. The application of large-scale domestic subsidies, either by the Chinese in the case of the solar panels industry, or and the case most recently of the United States for the application of various components of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. This leads to massive distortions to the globalization process. And these distortions, whether it's through tariffs or through subsidies or through other non-tariff barriers or distortions to trade, now become more prevalent because the international cop on the beat, the World Trade Organization, has been rendered increasingly powerless because of the position of a number of large powers, including the US, but not exclusively the US, to stand in the road of WTO reform and the reconstitution of the arbitration panels of it. On the second point, which Kishore addressed, which is on Security Council reform, he's right in terms of the historical position of various of the great powers seeking to preserve a position that they secured in 1945 at the San Francisco Conference as part of the compact and to get agreement to the full set of measures contained within the UN Charter, the power of the Security Council, the power of the UN General Assembly, and the creation of a large number of UN specialized agencies. If you roll the clock on, however, to the period that we now find ourselves in, which is something like 3/4 of a century later. What we see is the fundamental opposition to Security Council reform is, shall I say, slightly different. And that is, if you were to sit in a room quietly with the French and the Germans, as their relative position in the world begins to decline, those two countries know in particular that in order to sustain the long-term credibility of the Council, that those countries must therefore open the doors to other UN Security Council members, and thereby including countries such as India, including such countries such as Brazil, including countries such as Germany. And of course, the list becomes wider than that. When you look at the United States, I think it will be an interesting question now in the year 2022, if a matter was put to open debate and discussion within the Council and General Assembly, whether the United States would actually remain opposed to the inclusion of any of those individual nation states. What we do know for a fact is that when you were to include, for example, India, Japan, Germany, Brazil, that there are a range of countries who would oppose that. China, for example, opposes, though it does not say so explicitly, the inclusion of Japan and India because of long-standing geopolitical rivalries there. In the case of Germany, it raises questions of wider European politics, but also deep reservations on the part of the Russian Federation. As for Brazil, it's an open question as to where opposition would lie. So my point in response to Kishore is that yes, the opposition to UN Security Council reform still exists, but it actually is being mobilized by a number of states on the Council, and it is now a more diffuse debate than it used to be. Back to you.
Thank you so much. And now to Your Excellency Priyanka, do you see that, and do you feel that India ought to sit on the UN Security Council?
Oh, absolutely. And it should have been done as of yesterday rather than discussing it today. And Professor Mahbubani has very emphatically put the reasons across as to why India needs to be out there on that power table. It cannot become an exclusive table only for a few, barring those, and shutting your eyes to the idea of being, a nation of 1.3 billion and from 5th largest economy to moving towards the 3rd largest economy, and still blinding yourself to the belief that India is not important enough on that table. So absolutely, India needs to be doing that. We have been pushing for it. And it is time that global, those nations that are fighting for global supremacy understand the emerging nations and the emerging power of these nations. And that would truly be representative of how United Nations and its future looks, where it acknowledges that global world order is changing, and there are going to be a very different idea of how United Nations is perceived in countries such as India too, where it is truly representative, and how it was conceived and how it is voicing the opinion of the global order is something that would need to be relooked. And I would say, when we're talking about this growing idea of totalitarianism and shutting down on borders and where Professor Mehbubani spoke about how countries are now engaging into pacts and trade agreements. I think the COVID pandemic clearly showed the economic system, which was very fractured, the global economic system. It also showed a very fractured social system where we spoke about how global economy is helping everybody, how free borders is helping everybody. But it was at the same time, not many were speaking about, and which COVID exacerbated, was how wealthy people were becoming wealthier, poor becoming poorer, and that challenge not being addressed. And that has impacted everybody globally. So not what we're now seeing is not globalization per se, but regionalization, where regions are connecting and creating these trade pacts, trade agreements to be able to have free borders and coming to terms and understanding on the basis of their needs and how it will help them grow globally and in their own regions. So India is also seeing that, where we are engaging not just in one-to-one, but also multilaterals. And that is where India is leading, whether it's a Far East policy, Look East policy. Those are things that we are also addressing. And hopefully that will, and I would also want to bring in the entire Vaccine Maitri initiative that we had started, where when people, the nations which are globally empowered, which are the superpowers, were not helping out with the vaccines and reaching out of vaccines in nations such as Africa, in continents such as Africa, some parts of Asia. India took that lead. So those are things that when we talk about a united nation, is where everybody in moments of crisis breaks down these barriers rather than raising their hackles up and treat India, like we continue to say, our civilizational idea is of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which is we are one family. So we may be divided by geography, but we are united in the belief for better human outcomes. So that is how I would want to perceive United Nations future as well as the global shared future.
Thank you, Your Excellency. We now move on to the second round, and we have another group of discussants with us. From the Philippines, we have Gus Miklat, who comes from an NGO called Initiatives for International Dialogue.
Thank you, Amy. And first of all, thank you to Dr. Dino of FPCI and the Global Citizens for inviting me to be part of this very distinguished town hall. As I said, more than 7,000 around the world now in watching. I'll try to pack in a question each for our distinguished panelists in my 3 minutes. For the Honorable Kevin Rod, you did say something about the power of media, and in particular social media. And we all know that media is indeed the fourth estate. That's why it's called the fourth estate. But my question is, how do we colonize media instead of media colonizing the people? You see, media per se is a tool, is neutral, but it's up to who controls media, right? So when we say that media is a tool, how do we target also or make media, the barons of media, the targets of our advocacy? For the distinguished Honorable Priyanka, I was wondering what your thoughts are in how do we organize and mobilize feminist men in forwarding the issues of women. I think this is one aspect and one sector we need to tap into to get women's issues really out there. And for the Honorable Professor Kishore, I do agree about preventing other Sri Lankas in the future. But I do hope and would like to look at the other side of what happened to Sri Lanka, the response of the people of Sri Lanka to what has happened. How do we ensure that more of the responses of the Sri Lankan people become paramount, even without waiting for the other Sri Lanka to happen? You know, there are 2 elephants indeed in this world, but we have 7.8 billion thorns and 7-8 billion ants who can get these 2 elephants online. So how do we ensure that this other Sri Lanka, the response of people power to what has happened, be the way to go? in the world that we are in. And lastly, while I was listening to the Honorable Secretary General United Ban Ki-moon, he was even wearing this label of the SDG 16, SDG 16, challenging in response to the challenge of his predecessor Kofi Annan, who challenged civil society to build a network of civil society to prevent conflict, to shift from reaction to prevention. We did create a global partnership for the prevention of armed conflict and establish it at the UN headquarters itself in 2005. But I was wondering now, with these issues on Security Council, etc., these are all about states and nations. But we tend to forget that the first sentence of the Charter says, we, the peoples of the United Nations. Sometimes the peoples in the people's part has been forgotten. So how do we ensure that the peoples indeed are represented in the United Nations, not only through their states, but through by themselves, by civil society, their organization, etc. This is maybe civil society needs to be in the Security Council to prevent all of these wars that are happening around the world. But these are just random wild thoughts in a warm, humid morning here in the Philippines because of climate change. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you, Gus, and I hope that you are a male feminist. We move on to Argentina. We have Suve Eileen Matthew of the Argentine Network of Professionals on Foreign Policy.
Thank you to Global Town Hall organizers. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It is an honor for me to be here today representing the Argentine think tank, Gender and Youth. And it's essential to create spaces for debate like this between different sectors. From the Argentine Network of Professionals for Foreign Policies, called REDAPE, we intended to become a bridge between specialists from the government, academia, think tanks, and the private sector to achieve a multi-sectoral, peaceful, and conscious debate on current international challenges with public debate and fact-based journalism preventing fake news. I want to begin, first of all, by recalling that respect for human rights is a fundamental element for our world. They suppose the protection of the freedom and dignity of all people under condition of equality without admitting any discrimination. However, beyond the fact that there is a formal consensus on the relevance of these rights, we face a historical problem as humanity, which is inequality. It especially affects vulnerable and marginalized groups where youth and females suffer greatly. As a Latin American, inequality matters to me, and as a young woman specifically, I want to bring to this debate my concern for the problems and challenges that some populations still face today, such as unequal access to opportunity for personal development, connectivity problems or the lack of it, or even not being able to access rights such as health or education. Therefore, to reduce inequality, I agree that we must work together on diversity and inclusion policies. Argentina has a historical background with outstanding progress in recent decades, defending the rights of the most vulnerable. I believe that it is essential to ensure access to quality and inclusive education for young people, especially to those who cannot afford it. Let me remember that each and every one of us has a fundamental role and duty in this challenge against inequality, because as a great human being who fought for equality's sake, it is not only the oppression and cruelty by some people that causes this, it's also the silence over that by the good people. My question for this debate is, I know that the latest US report from the Biden administration that was released a few days ago clearly states that the international system is in process of change, that the post-Cold War international system that began in 1991 has ended, and that globalization will no longer set the international agenda. So it will be the competition between the great powers. The change clearly occurs in the American liberal international order, but now I want to know how will this change in the international system in the future? How will the competition between the great powers be defined? Thank you very much in the name of REDAPE.
Thank you for your question. And finally, we have from Sri Lanka, a very hot topic this session, Aaron Rodrigo. He's a student activist, and you could say that he was one of the ants that toppled the elephant in his country. Aaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy. And I would like to thank Dr. Dino Parijala as well as FPCI for this platform as well. So I would like to go back to actually the first question on Twitter. I would like to comment a bit on it. So I think being a follower of Elon Musk, I see that he's a very interesting character as well, because he has very differing views. And to me, Twitter, I think democracy is a double-edged sword, right? So the pro is that people have a voice, and the con is also that people have a voice. So you have to separate the meat from the chop, which is like the good from the bad. And the problem with this is that if you look at countries like who hold me, I mean, we see with TikTok as well. TikTok is a great tool that China uses to get information on its users, but at the same hand, domestically, it controls information, and that's where it does best, because with the control, you can easily have great influence and power to its people. So going back to Elon, I think the problem with Twitter goes back to like this term the West has kind of originated, called cancel culture. See, Elon said that he wants to give Twitter a platform where all, including the privileged and the people who are canceled, to speak. The problem with this is that obviously there's going to be a lot of issues like racial remarks, or maybe very obscure comments that could hurt communities, and hate speech like anti-Semitism that's kind of rising right now in the US. So the thing with this is, I do think that the thing with cancel culture, I think deep down, the people have been canceled because as a result of our system and how our society is constructed. I think we lack forgiveness and empathy, especially when it comes to people having opposing views. And even when people keep making these mistakes, we just seem to we can disagree, and we still like it, and we can still debate, because debate is essential for progress. And I just feel like we just lack a little more empathy. Not saying that we should agree with what people say. So that's what I would like to say on the Elon Musk issue. Secondly, I would like to
ask— You're running out of time. You have to ask your question now.
Yeah. The question is on political correctness, where there's been a lot of empty promises and a lack of desire to accomplish what leaders and people in power set out to do. How can we change this? How can we change the political correctness and how people who set out what they want to do is not being done, if that's clear?
Okay, I think we can start with the Honorable Kevin Rudd, followed by the Honorable Priyanka, and then Professor Kishore. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And unfortunately, after my answer to this question, I'll need to leave you. On the questions that were posed by our friends from around the world, as they relate to the freedom of the press, the freedom of the media, and the responsibilities of the media, traditional media, non-traditional media, mainstream newspapers, online or offline, social media, or still the important question of electronic media. I would say this. It's important that we are very clear in our mind about what the alternatives are on the question of media freedom. There is one model in the world, which is the state owns and controls the media. That model, for example, is the People's Republic of China. People like Kishore and myself, if we're living in China today, our ability to express the views that we have just put in this discussion would probably barely be able to be published. And if we were more extreme in our views and were critical of current Chinese domestic policy, including its regulation of the media, we'd be prohibited from making those points. So state ownership and control of the media is an unacceptable model from my own perspective. And we need to be very clear about that. So then secondly, you go to another model, which is called free media. Well, on the question of free media, it then becomes a question of how either the media regulates itself or what form of regulation exists for a free media around core ethical principles. Now, on the self-regulation of the media, you have in various democracies things like press councils, media councils, which impose professional obligations on individual journalists and editors to separate out the questions of fact from opinion and to give people rights of reply if they're attacked in the media. These are in varying stages of strength and weakness around the world. And certainly in the United States, in Australia, in the United Kingdom, there are many weaknesses in self-regulation. But here is the problem. Unless the media more effectively self-regulates on professional standards, fact and opinion, and a diversity of opinion, plus people being provided with rights of reply, then ultimately what happens with the mainstream world is they walk away from traditional media platforms and rely exclusively on social media platforms. Which brings me to my final point about the question again raised by our friend in Sri Lanka about Elon Musk and social media and the future of Twitter. The world will be watching super carefully if Elon Musk's stated position about cancel culture and about political correctness, if that results in a tide or a tidal wave or an avalanche of hate speech and hate media. Because if the price of political correctness is that we raise our eyebrows and are not willing to tolerate people using free social media platforms to promote hatred and intolerance towards racial minorities within our own countries, or hatred and tolerance against other countries, then if that sort of thing becomes legitimized through the Elon Musk doctrine of removing constraints around free speech, around the Elon Musk doctrine of dealing with political correctness, around the Elon Musk doctrine of dealing with cancel culture, if the price for that is unleashing the floodgates of racial hatred, then I think we are into a whole new world of pain. And that's, again, to repeat what I said before, is where the regulators would need to step in. Those, I think, are the options which lie ahead of us. And unless we embrace what I describe as highly effective forms of self-regulation by all media platforms, that is, traditional and non-traditional, then of course legislatures will step in to impose other forms of regulation to prevent the dismemberment of our societies through hatred. Back to you. It's been great to be part of this dialogue, but regrettably I must leave you now.
Thank you so much for your insights and your time. It's been illuminating, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you. We now move on to the Honorable Priyanka. The floor is yours.
So out of all the questions, the question about how men can be participants to ensuring women are heard, and that is a very important question, because the onus of women being heard, being at the power tables, at policy-making spaces, political spaces, corporate spaces, or various other powerful arenas of work, men need to partner that. Men need to talk about that, and it cannot. The onus cannot be just on we women talking about our gender. The gender equality is not just a gender perspective. It's about everybody espousing the cause of equality but not in terms of implementation. We see it not really being spoken about. So if someone was to ask me what are the things they can do, I would say the first step is to shun all these manuals. Most of the time, all the panelists that come on, various debates, discussions, and talking about global issues, talking about economic issues, consequences of the free trade agreements, and how it has helped the world. You're a woman out too. Maybe she may not have the kind of confidence that you men usually have, but you have to be builders of that confidence. So shun these manuals, ask for a woman at the table, ask for a woman in the discussion. I would say consciously speak up on every policy issue that you'll get a chance to speak up on. Look at the intersectionality of gender equality. Again, everything comes from the perspective of equality. Are we giving them equal opportunities? Are we giving them equal access? So make it a point to bring it out in every conversation. Third, I would always say that whenever policy is being shaped up, that is one intersectionality that needs to be looked at. And in whichever geographical boundaries you might be in, we need to consciously ask for gender representation. Push political parties, push political representatives for their views on women and what are they willing to do, and how much are they going to prioritize women's issues when they talk about climate change, when they talk about technology, when they talk about employment, when they talk about economic participation, when they talk about growth of the global order per se, the global economic goals that everybody shares. So those are things which I think men would be extremely, I would say, helpful in partnering the burden of equality. Gender equality is something that should become the responsibility of everybody. And again, the fight is a long fight. We have been fighting the fight, but it wouldn't have been possible if we did not have men also realizing that there is not enough space for women, and we need to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for speaking up for women, Your Honorable Priyanka. And we now move to Professor Kishore. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to endorse everything that Priyanka said about giving greater voice to women. I completely support you, Priyanka, in those efforts. Let me quickly deal with 3 questions. One was the first one about people power from Gus Miklat. Secondly, from Soye about great power competition. And thirdly, social media, Aaron, very, very quickly. Now, on people power, it's of course very good, Gus, to have people power if you can remove bad rulers, and that's excellent. But after you remove bad rulers is when the hard work begins. Because as you know, unfortunately, and I can give you some examples, where people power removes bad rulers, and then they're replaced by bad rulers. And then from the point of view of people at the bottom, the very poor, life doesn't improve at all. But the good news we have is that in East Asia and South Asia, we have been very successful in poverty reduction. Billions have been rescued from poverty. How do we do that? And the answer is good governance. And those 2 words have not been used at all in this entire debate. And I want to emphasize that good governance is very important especially for developing countries. And I can tell you that when I was Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy for 13 years, I gave away the secret of Singapore's success. And I said that good governance in Singapore rests on 3 principles. I call them MPH. MPH doesn't stand for miles per hour. MPH stands for meritocracy, pragmatism, honesty. And I gave an absolute guarantee to the students of the Lee Kuan Yew School when I was Dean, that if you implement MPH, your country will succeed. So I hope that in addition to people power, we will also emphasize good governance as being critical for developing countries. Now, secondly, on great power competition, so I wrote a book called Has China Won? About the US-China geopolitical contest, which is why I'm unfortunately very confident that great power contest between US and China will become the dominant driving global force. And it will affect even a country like Argentina, by the way. Because, in Argentina, as you know, under the Monroe Doctrine, is supposed to be under the United States sphere of influence. No other great power can come into Latin America. And even though the doctrine is half alive, half dead. As you know, now many Latin American countries do more trade with China than you do with United States. To give you an example from your neighbor, Brazil, it took Brazil in the year 2000, 1 year to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 72 hours to export $1 billion to China. How can you ask Brazil to cut off its major trading partner? So my suggestion, which I put in my book, Has China Won, is that all the other 6 billion people who live outside the United States, outside China, should tell these two elephants, please, we don't want to take sides. If you want to fight, you go and fight. We're not going to take sides. Not our problem, you know. So I think if all the countries in the world tell the United States and China, we're not taking sides, I think that might help to moderate the competition between US and China. And finally, on social media, I want to emphasize that the issue is very complex. And it is not easy to find black and white answers. I mean, I agree with Kevin, complete state control as you have in China is not the answer. Complete freedom, frankly, is also not the answer because you unleash hate speech and so on and so forth. So somewhere in the middle, you've got to walk a middle path and allow some degree of regulation, but of course not over-regulation. And how you do that, frankly, is something that each country has got to work out because we have different cultures, different histories, and it's a mistake to think that what works in the United States is going to work in every other country in the world. And I must emphasize that the United States today, and I speak as a friend of the United States, has never been as divided and polarized as it is today. And unfortunately, when you have no restrictions and no restraints, people believe falsehoods. You know, for example, take the biggest falsehood of recent times. The supporters of Donald Trump still do not believe that Joe Biden was legitimately elected. Amazing, right? All the data is there, the ballot boxes are there, television is there, but because you have unchecked social media repeating falsehoods, it's amazing that falsehoods can replace truth in the minds of people. And that's very dangerous.
Thank you, Professor. We now have questions from the public. And there is, I'm asked to pick one. Professor Kishore, is it economics or political? Many countries appear to be becoming more autocratic, and that powerful countries appear to support autocratic regimes. What is your take on this?
Well, I would say in our world is a very complex place. I mean, let's just take ASEAN, okay? Among the 10 ASEAN countries, you have democracies, you have a military regime, you have a monarchy, you have, I guess, guided democracy, you know, you have such a variety. But I don't think the trend is towards autocracy. And to give you a good example, okay, our host country, Indonesia. You know, when I was the permanent secretary, when Indonesia was affected by the Asian financial crisis, and when President Suharto was toppled, as you know, in I think 98 or 99, everyone thought that Indonesia would descend into chaos after the collapse of the dictatorship of Suharto. But instead, what you see is that Indonesia today has the world's most successful democracy in the Islamic world. Amazing. This is an amazing success story, right? So I think it's a mistake to think that you have a trend towards autocracies. But I also want to emphasize that this is, of course, politically incorrect. You can also have good governments when you have autocratic rulers. You know, you can have bad governance when you have democratic systems. So let's be honest about this and not just say it's not a simple black and white issue. And I would say, instead of looking into whether or not countries have democratic rulers or autocratic rulers, it's a question of which countries have had good governance. And the best test of good governance is very simple. which countries have succeeded in eradicating absolute poverty. And if countries eradicate absolute poverty, then I think they have fulfilled the mission of the governance.
Thank you, Professor. Are there additional questions? I think we've got time for 2 more. I'm going to mention Gus' question because it's an issue that needs to be highlighted. Has the world forgotten Myanmar, where its people are being pulverized by a very brutal military regime? The reports coming out from Myanmar is absolutely horrific. There are even people who are beheaded just simply for being a teacher at a school that is in a region of the NUG government, people who did not preach any ideology. So has the world forgotten Myanmar in the face of the Ukraine-Russia war? Perhaps the Honorable Priyanka could answer this, could take this question followed by Professor Kishore, because India does have been getting refugees from Myanmar. Thank you.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. And I think Professor Kishore Mehbubani had, when he spoke in the context of Sri Lanka, he actually highlighted the challenges that when you're talking about 2 global superpowers fighting for supremacy, what is being overlooked is something like what is happening in Myanmar. Human rights violations and, increasing, violent attacks is something that we should be speaking about. Economic crisis in Sri Lanka had just a passing reference. So they are not just a dot in geography. There are human lives involved. There are challenges involved. And like I said, a truly representative United Nations would be the one which discusses the smallest country to the largest country, which is supporting the entire idea of United Nations. It cannot become a closed door idea of focusing. Of course, what is happening in Ukraine and Russia is something which will have a ripple effect globally. But there are challenges that other nations face and which cannot be overlooked. And I totally agree with Gus here that we need to discuss this more, bring it on panel discussions more, talk about it more, simply because most of the world is not even aware of the challenges that are being faced in Myanmar. And yes, India faces this this issue of refugees coming from there. But India, I would say across centuries, has been a nation which has widely tried to help as many people who've been facing these kind of challenges, facing these kind of issues. But of course, it comes to also being able to sustain that kind of, we have a population which is large enough and being able to sustain with whatever we can manage and having a small land mass. So these are things that like Professor Mehbubani put very emphatically, and I would say very correctly, that we need to bring to the table and discuss more.
Professor Kishore,
Yes,
could you take Myanmar?
Yeah, well, when I was dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, I had the pleasure and honor of hosting Aung San Suu Kyi when she came to our school. So I met her personally a few times. I'm a fan and admirer of hers. And I think we should condemn the military coup in Myanmar and the removal of Aung San Suu Kyi. But at the same time, as someone who studied politics for 50 years, one lesson I have learned is that there are no black and white solutions for difficult problems like Myanmar. And the big secret I'm going to give away to all of you is that this coup could have been prevented. People who are in the inside within Myanmar know this, by the way. This coup could have been prevented if both sides could have compromised a little bit. Because at the end of the day, if the military is not part of the solution, the military becomes the problem. And you people forget that, when Aung San Suu Kyi went to The Hague, you remember she went to The Hague, she actually defended what the Myanmar military had done. And one reason why she did that, because her father was a general also. She understands very well that you have to include the military as part of the solution. What happened is that the story inside is very complex. At the last minute, they couldn't compromise. And because they couldn't compromise, you had this coup. But if you want to find a solution for Myanmar, a realistic solution would be one where it's a 50-50 solution, where the military will have some power and the civilian government will have some power. And I must say, I hope that we can get Aung San Suu Kyi out of solitary confinement, because I can tell you that if you ask me what the nightmare I would have in my life is to be confined in solitary confinement. In the past, you must know that when Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest, she was under house arrest. It's one thing to be arrested in your house, it's another thing to be put in solitary confinement in a prison. So I think we should all worry about her condition and do as much as we can to send messages that we must take care of Aung San Suu Kyi.
Thank you, Professor Kishore. I think that we have about another 5 more minutes, and maybe just one last question, or just very, very quickly to wrap this up. There's a question from Indonesia, the host. As the US prepares to deploy a nuclear-capable B-52 bombers to Australia, do you think instead of promoting security and as a deterrence against China, this will only lead to a backlash from Southeast Asian countries who see this as a detriment to general peace and security in the region? Maybe Professor Kishore can take this question. And 2 minutes.
You give me the difficult ones. I agree with the questioner that one of the things that we have to worry about, one of the great achievements of human history is that since 1945, after the United States, which is the only country that has actually dropped nuclear bombs on any country, is the United States. As you know, they dropped 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. No other country has used nuclear bombs for now, it's coming to 77 years, I guess, right? And so we have to protect that non-proliferation treaty, protect that regime. And one way of doing that is what, as you know, the Southeast Asian countries have declared a nuclear weapon-free zone in Southeast Asia. And I think if Australia was wise, Australia, which is a good friend of ASEAN and understands ASEAN very well, and I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle. I wish that Australia would follow ASEAN in keeping nuclear weapons out of Southeast Asia. So it's a bit dangerous for Australia to flirt with not just with nuclear weapons, but also nuclear submarines. As you know, the AUKUS deal is another thing that I think is unwise on the part of Australia. It's better for Australia to behave more like its Southeast Asian neighbors rather than behave like a piece of Europe in Asia.
Professor, thank you so much. And also thank you to the Honorable Priyanka Chaturvedi and all the discussants for their very excellent questions. It's been a great session. If I may just very quickly sum up, we talk about the decoupling of the world, also a plea for the world to remember Myanmar. Also, the Honorable Priyanka argued very passionately for women's rights, warnings from the Honorable Kevin Rudd on the potential for good as well as the potential for destruction from social media. These are all very important points for us to remember as we go forward into the new year, seeing that the war in Russia has no end in sight for the time being, and we are all having to live with very high food and energy prices that could affect the stability in our respective region. And I hope that we take away from this the importance of coming together, as Professor Kishore argued for, and also for countries like Sri Lanka, who just got rid of an elephant, and that whichever government is in place now to look into and to prioritize good governance. With this, I would like to close this amazing session, and thank you all and have a good day.
Thank you, Amy. Goodbye.
Thank you. Terima kasih.